do not attempt to adjust your settings. We have commandeered this channel and are now streaming our pirate broadcast. This is the Pirate Stream. Welcome to the Pirate Stream Dialectical Dissidents, episode 21, if you can believe that. 21. With me, as always, is Scott Armstrong and Courtenay Turner here to discuss the woes of the world. How are you guys today?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Happy to be back with you guys again.
Yeah, likewise.
How you doing, Courtney?
I'm doing all right. I'm hanging in there.
Yeah.
Hanging in there. Yeah, I feel you.
I'm saying that for about 4 years, right?
Exactly.
All
Yeah.
right. All things considered, you know.
Yeah, all things considered, pretty good. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, before we get too far into it, I do have a question. And I know this is on everybody's mind out there watching, but Brian, I want to know, what is in your pouch that you wear here?
Yes.
I'm so curious.
It's funny that somebody actually, while we were at a rally, I think here in Tennessee, asked me the same question. Like, this is curious, but it's I've addressed it many times in the show. It's metaphysics. Okay. It's like it's basically a bunch of different stones with different properties. Like, you can see the little one right here underneath the cross that I have that my brother gave me. Mm-hmm. I think this one specifically is supposed to, like, ward off negative energy, but there people will think that seems ridiculous, but there's plenty of other things in there. Like the example is the metal bracelets people wear that we're told like help your joints and so on. It's the same concept. The different stones and metals and different types of materials, and they have different properties, and so different things in there will be like, energy or different, who's to say if they work in a way that like truly makes a difference, but I believe it does. I believe these things have a difference on, it's like this idea we talk about, like grounding and how you stand on the earth. And, I think that we're more symbiotic with this world around us than we realize. And like, to me, this is about, taking precautions to make yourself mentally healthy and also kind of be, I believe there's negative energy all over out there that to ward off, in my opinion.
Well, I definitely agree. And, really interesting. So I started a show with Dr. Lee Merritt. We're doing, it's called Dangerous Aims. And next week's episode is actually going to be on scalar energy.
Scalar energy?
Yeah. So it's kind of like a 0 point energy, like the stuff that Tesla was working on.
Nikola Tesla.
Yeah. Nikola Tesla.
Not Tesla's company that,
No, not Elon Musk.
Elon Musk,
no, not that one. But yeah, so when you talk about like warding off negative energies and grounding, that sort of thing, I definitely believe in it, but not, I think people conflate it with like a mystical woo-woo type of, and not to, I don't have the answers, certainly, I don't know, I'm not the arbiter of truth, but I do know that I don't necessarily think of it that way. I think of it more in terms of like negative, positive ions.
Exactly.
And with different metals have different properties, and that's why they can be beneficial for things like grounding and for
completely. But I would say too that to take it to a point of like where, and the reason I like, if you go to a store that sells different stones in this kind of purpose, they'll always come with little descriptions like, this is what this one, the properties of it. And to say like that it wards off negative energy, like I would say that is into the realm of like a mystical concept, because that's not about, like it has this direct effect on the flow of the energy in your body. But then at the same time, right?
Well, what is negative energy for you? Right. So I actually think it is in how they steer you into thinking that it is a mystical. I don't necessarily know the right word, because there are mystical properties to it still, but I think it's still quantifiable, because
I agree. Yeah, I
we
think
all
they
have a different energy makeup. So
it's interesting. It is, because I think what it speaks to is more of an overlap to the things that we tend to, like you're saying, like we put a line, like anything past that line is fake.
Right.
It's like, well, I think there's a lot of things we think are fake that actually aren't.
A really, really great example of it is you're probably familiar with the movie The Secret.
I don't
like the law is based on the law of attraction.
I don't think I've seen it.
I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah. It was is
it based on the book, The Secret?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
I've heard of that. Yeah.
Okay. So the book, The Secret, then the movie, and the premise for that came out of like the Theosophical movement, which was, and then it was codified by Alice Bailey, who is a disciple of Madame Blavatsky, who started the Theosophical movement. And so it's a very kind of like new age principle, but there are actual principles in physics that corroborate it. So they kind of took it in a direction that I think was a bit of a deception that was, designed to, I think, deceive people and create a movement,
I think the new age movement in general is that. Yeah. Right?
No,
sum it up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Circumventing things we can prove.
We could have a whole nother conversation on that. I actually just did a radio show on the Theosophical Society, and maybe next time I'll bring this for the topic, but I did about the Lucius Trust, because that's fascinating. It's driving the UN.
Yep, that's a weird one.
I agree. I think the new age movement, but I think the mistake people make, this is to your point, is that people will say that if something is you know, like a decoy or a deceptive ploy, that there's no truth in it. And that was my point, is that there are principles in physics that can corroborate it. That doesn't mean that the whole concept that they were presenting is true.
You know, that's actually a perfect, interesting segue into what you're going to talk about, because we're talking about, which that probably
and what I did it. Talk about
smart. Yeah, well, that it's almost always, in my opinion, I shouldn't even frame it almost always, but as because we're looking at these things, it's used that way, that they put something fake over something real, so we don't know, or more so the average person chooses to omit it or overlook it because they're following along with what the mainstream suggests they should look at. And so that's very interesting. So let's so we're going to talk about some interesting things today in general. I guess to sum it up very quickly, we're going to start with the conversation of Osama bin Laden letter and that whole dynamic that we all think is very interesting. We're going to talk about the January 6th videos and information that's come out that I think we're all aware of continues to add to the reality that this was some sort of operation. And generally, I'm going to finish on some of the stuff I've been talking about the ongoing information around Israel and the different, the updates to what we've been talking about and the reality of how many things have been shown to be lied about. But most interestingly is that Haaretz, I don't know if you guys have heard this, as of yesterday, the day before, has now confirmed per Haaretz and per the Israeli military that they did in fact shoot their own people on the 7th. Now, to what degree, that's still what I've always been saying is, we have to consider if that did happen, to what degree, and then how does that change the perception of what happened? It's really interesting. All of these things kind of swing around, in my opinion, the idea of government manipulation over our lives in ways to influence the way we perceive the world around us, and it's very constant. It just never stops. And so let's start with the idea of this letter itself. And it is really interesting because this is something that, well, I'll go ahead. I'll let you start because this is what you wanted to bring up today.
So my interest in this is there's all these different angles to the story. And if anybody that's looked into 9/11, you go down the path of Osama bin Laden, Al Qaeda, the origins, and you realize very quickly that, a lot of this stuff is not presented to us in a very correct manner, right? So when you go to look at the history of Osama bin Laden himself and how they were put into power, Al Qaeda and all these guys to fight Russia and all this stuff, and they're CIA groomed and funded and trained and all this stuff, and it's well, that's really interesting. And so my whole interest in this is this particular letter that just all of a sudden gone viral again. You know what I mean? Did he actually even write it? And then who would write it? And so a couple things that I wanted to present is first of all is the fact that even before 9/11 happened, everybody kind of in the OG truth community was looking at this and they were okay, this Osama bin Laden character that's been created is the perfect fall guy for some major event that's about to happen, right? And so anyway, so that's the clip. That's the clip. So I don't know if
you wanted to go to the Bill.
Yeah, I was going to So for those of you that haven't seen this or heard this before, this is William Cooper's the guy that wrote Behold a Pale Horse, and this is him on June 28, 2001, a couple months before obviously 9/11, and this is his take on the whole situation.
Now, just before we play this, though, just on the opening of the conversation. So the idea being about the question of whether or not this was written by him or somebody else. So let's just, before we play this clip, because it's 3 minutes, I don't want to get away from the point. Let's flesh it out just a touch, because I think it's exactly what I was kind of posing during one of the recent shows where I touched on this, that it's very interesting to me and very concerning that we're watching this kind of binary dynamic around this concept. Whereas we know that James Corbett and others, Ben Swan's an excellent documentary. I mean, it's even during Dave Smith's debate, it's interesting that this is something that we are beginning to see, despite the government and the media and the way they keep talking about it, has become a ubiquitous reality that we all understand. Our government created, armed, and funded these elements. Doesn't mean every part of it, doesn't mean they haven't lost control of it, but it's a fact. And so that then means that he was an asset of the CIA or the people behind it, whether he knew it or not. I think we all know this, but for people that are new to this, it may sound shocking. And the point would be that there's a lot of evidence that proves this, right? So then what does that ultimately mean? If the letter is saying, as we remember, that we did this for, because of the U.S. foreign policy and the genuine grievances we all seem to understand, blowback and all these different concepts, what does that mean then? Did he write it? Does that mean that even if he did, he doesn't mean it? Right. So go ahead. What do you think, Courtney?
So what I think is really interesting about this, and you talk about the binary aspect of it, and this is, definitely, I think, the the key element that we need to focus on, because what we're seeing right now is there's a bunch of videos circulating, particularly on TikTok, where a bunch of Gen Z, and I think that that's what this is aimed at psyoping them, because most of them really weren't aware of this, previously.
Psyoping what way?
So I'll explain. So
a
lot of them are reading this letter, and they're all like, at least the videos I've seen, they're hysterically like sobbing, like,
weird.
Oh my gosh, we were wrong, and this means he was a good guy. And so this
fall into the next trap.
Right, exactly. So now two things can simultaneously occur, and it really reminds me of a lot of the the people on the political right, if you will, or the dissident right, who have suddenly decided that because the left has gone so bonkers and the West has become so corrupt, Putin must be our ally and he's our savior. No, he may be rejecting some of the values that the West is exporting that we, particularly people of more conservative values may not align with. And so therefore we may champion that. That in no way means that he's our ally or savior in any way.
Or any government for that matter.
Right, exactly. So, but I see it as very similar kind of false dialectic that's occurring. And I think that's what's happening here, is that this is being framed to try and now make him out to psyop the younger generation into thinking he's some sort of a hero.
Interesting. So why would you think that would benefit them?
I think it would benefit them because they're creating in my opinion, I think it's another dialectic between what's going on with the war in the Middle East right now. So, you have people, as we talked about last time, with very heightened passions on both sides. And I personally think there's a lot of evidence to indicate that the same people are pulling strings on both sides. Right. And, but the narrative that's being portrayed that they want you to believe is that it's a religious war and that they care about either the Palestinians or, the Jews, which in my opinion, I don't think that the powers that be care about either one of them, and they're just using them as pawns to advance their international world order, New World Order agenda.
But how fascinating is this, that like Osama bin Laden, who historically, if you ask anybody 15, 20 years ago, would be the most evil man in the world. Right. How in the world have they been able to flip the script to such a degree where now Osama bin Laden is like the good guy, the sympathizer? Like that is like a mind manipulation beyond anything possible. It's almost like now we're like Hillary Clinton and George Bush are like best friends. Like George Bush is a good guy. George Bush is one of the good guys, right? It's like so crazy how they've created a scenario where we're like, oh yeah, Osama bin Laden, he's such a great guy.
If that was their objective, though, I'm not sold on it. I
personally do think it's their objective because I'll try to make this really brief, but I go through the philosophical roots of the dialectic quite often, and I talk about like this is philosophically we could say it predates Plato, but I think Plato really codified it. And again, I'll try to make it brief, but just we're familiar with like the allegory of the cave, right? There's the intelligible realm, the dividing line, the unintelligible realm, and then we have Kant, who talked about the thesis. He was attributed to talking about thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It was actually John Gottlieb Fichte is how it's pronounced, who talked about that. And then Fichte was who showed Hegel, who's often attributed to the Hegelian dialectic. And he definitely progressed it into a methodology. And it was Fichte who showed him, who was very much a mystic. He was a very high level Freemason, very much a proponent of the Enlightenment movement. And I only bring up that point to show that he was, someone who was into Hermetic and alchemical principles. And this is something that Hegel really ran with. And Hegel rejected both. It was through Fichte that he saw he could do this. He rejected Kant. He rejected Plato's notion of the dialectic because he felt that they were too abstract. It was too intellectual, and he wanted something that could progress the historicity of man. So he actually said that it was the abstract, negative, concrete. And the really important part is that middle part, the negative. It's the negation, which the German word translates to sublation. The word was actually Aufheben. I'm going to butcher the German pronunciation. I won't even bother trying. But Aufheben is a very interesting oxymoronic term because it means to lift up and preserve while simultaneously tearing down and cancel. It was from this that the Frankfurt School then derived the term Afhaven du Culture, which of course means cancel culture, which I don't think I need to expound too much on today. Most people are pretty familiar with this. I think a lot of the audience, certainly, I think you two of you get that. We know about that one. But the reason I bring this all up is because the best way that I could visually explain this is, I talk about the spiral that's going up to the omega point, which I believe is the New World Order. Of course, Hegel talked about the state being the God, the one that we're all aspiring toward. But another image would be the Ouroboros, right? The snake eating its tail. Right. So the concretization came out of this initial abstract, which was this idea that presents itself. And then you have the negation, the nullification of it. And so I think that's what we're seeing with all these dialectical paradigms. You have what looks like the canceling out, but really it becomes this spiral.
Right.
And so when you talk about how crazy that is to see that they could flip this whole narrative on its head, but really it just becomes a progression. So it's not actually canceling out because it's these parts that become subsumed and present the new abstract, which then of course,
yeah. See, I love that you bring in the that aspect to it. It's important to understand the logic and the ideology around the whole thing. And what's interesting is that, like the point that I was going to bring up, and like you're showing, is that it's not like this deviation or shift; it's the circular continuation of what they're doing. That now it's become, like, to your point, to make sure people didn't miss that, is that they're saying it's a religious war and they hate the Jews, or they hate this, or the whole point is they're trying to make it about back and forth, and that ultimately this makes that point seem more reality. Like, look at all these people that now side with Osama bin Laden. And then they say this is what he wanted to do. And which seems to then almost contradict what the letter says, which is weird, but either way. So that's very fascinating, I think. But so I wonder, back to the letter point, if we know that this is to some, an asset of the CIA, to make it simple, but it's all, there's more nuance than that.
Sure.
Why would they have him write this letter that way? Or do we think that this is something that he actually wrote, that he really thought? Because I mean, look, I think anybody can look at that letter and go, well, yeah, not to justify attacking somebody or killing civilians, but there's reasonable grievances for what we all now see, I believe, is belligerent U.S. foreign policy. So why would they then want the letter then to be framed that way and then not engage with it then? What do you think about that? It's just an interesting kind of, that's one of the reasons that I feel a little bit of doubt about whether that was the actual objective, and whether or not they're maybe just using that now, or, I don't know. How do you see it? Why would they have written it then? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it also almost might even be a good to present that other article that I sent you, the CNN one, where he's actually saying, like, on September 17th, like less than a week after the event, he's saying, I didn't do this. Like, you guys, like, no, this wasn't me. Like, that was Osama bin Laden. This is according to CNN, right? And this is the only reference I can find on that. I've heard people talking about it, but like, if he's on the one hand denying having anything to do with 9/11, and then on the other hand, like, putting out something like this, it contradicts it.
Or interestingly enough, it almost adds to the point about whether he might, look, just because somebody is being used, it's possible they may not be completely in line with the people using them, or that he may decide.
Fully aware.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so this point almost adds to that maybe he wrote that because that is what he felt. And, and that this is him kind of saying, look, I am being used as an asset. Again, none of this means that we're then saying he's not an extremist or you should support him. And that's the weird dynamic we're seeing on the TikTok aspect. Exactly. We're just trying to understand the reality of it. And ultimately this, he's, even before you could look back in his history, he's obviously a pretty extreme person, right? And that's obvious and not deniable.
But does he even exist? Because look, if you look at this, okay, when you do a site, like a specific targeted search for the word Tim Osman, right? If you guys don't know, there's like a FOIA document that has on the CIA website, says belonging to CIA's Tim Osman, aka Osama bin Laden, aka Santa Claus. Did he even exist? Is he just a figment of all of our imagination?
Yeah. Right.
I think he's just completely just made up.
Well, here's a good point. Time to play the clip, and then I'll bring these up when we come back. All right. So this is the clip again to reestablish where we were of Bill Cooper, and this was 2001 during June 28, 2001 radio broadcast.
Hour of the time.
Go check. Can you believe what you have been seeing on CNN today, ladies and gentlemen? Can you believe it? Supposedly, a CNN reporter found Osama bin Laden, took a television camera crew with him, went into Osama bin Laden's hideout, interviewed him and his top leadership, his top lieutenants and colonels and generals in their hideout. This is a CNN reporter with a camera crew. And he came out and told everybody, within 3 weeks, Osama bin Laden is going to attack the United States and Israel. Now, don't you think that's kind of strange, folks? You see, because the largest intelligence apparatus in the world, with the biggest budget in the history of the world, has been looking for Osama bin Laden for years and years and years, and can't find him. The FBI also, under the leadership of Louis Freeh, has been looking for Osama bin Laden for years and years and years and years and years and many years, and can't find him. Some doofus jerk-off reporter with a camera crew waltzes right into his hideout and interviews him. And you know what his budget is? Zip, zilch, nothing. Now, that tells us two things. Either everyone in the intelligence community and all of the intelligence agencies of the United States government are blithering idiots and incompetent fools, including the entire apparatus of the FBI and all of their personnel, or they're lying to us. They're not looking for him at all. And the second is the truth. You see, the CIA created Osama bin Laden. They recruited him. They trained him. They found his leadership. They brought them all together. They showed them how to fight the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and when that was over, they still continued to fund him and train him, and they're now using him to help bring about world government by making him the big boogeyman, because they can't use Saddam Hussein anymore, because they needed a new boogeyman. A reporter from CNN and his little camera crew got in to Osama bin Laden's secret hideout and conducted an interview. If you don't believe me, tune into CNN. They're probably running it right now as I'm speaking. And if you believe it, you are one of the stupidest jerks that ever lived on the face of this earth. And whatever is going to happen that they're going to blame on Osama bin Laden, don't you even believe it.
Don't you believe it, folks?
Yeah. But I miss Bill Cooper. Huh? A lot of important things. I want to include James Corbett's documentary, as well as Ben Swan also did an excellent one a long time ago. But just it breaks down the obvious reality that these were, the simplest way to put it, Western, specifically in my opinion, Israeli and U.S. government proxy elements. Mm-hmm. And this is again something that Dave Smith said recently, that this is important that we don't miss. That the U.S. government and Israel have been funding the most extreme elements of Islam for decades, for stated strategic purposes, right? And so there's
the British intelligence.
Well, I'm just saying this from an American perspective, but you're right. Yeah, I think that it's from a U.S. perspective. I think it's important, but you're right. It's far more than just these. That's why I said Western specifically. Yeah. But obviously, the point is that how then can we pretend like all of these aspects don't then lead right back to them, or at the very least have an honest conversation about how they're complicit with funding these people that then got out of control. It's just very, very interesting.
And by the way, wasn't Israel responsible for 9/11 anyway? No, I'm just kidding.
Well, no, it's not, it's funny you say that though. It's not kidding. Like to say responsible is, I think, maybe
I'm joking.
No, but let's seriously though.
There's some funny business going on.
It's not to say responsible is a little bit too all encompassing, but 100% Israel, in my opinion, was involved with what happened. Yeah. I think and just going back to James' work in general, he does the 9/11 culprits and the dancing Israelis, as well as a lot of other aspects of it. it's, in my opinion, there's no denying that there was an element of involvement. Would you guys agree with that?
Yeah.
I think there's an element. I think that I would be careful. I agree with you about saying responsible, because I think
he was kidding. I know.
No, I think he was. I thought so too.
Because there's a viral thing going around right now about I think it was like Eli David, Mr. Propaganda man right now. He was making a point about somebody, I don't think it was even somebody that large, who just put up a picture of 9/11 and said Israel did 9/11. And then he was like, Elon, you allow this on your platform? And it's like, it's just, these people are trying to get anybody censored for things like, that's not, look, that's in any other context before, like the YouTube, like you're not allowed to challenge historical events.
Right.
Of course you're allowed to state that. You're not, there's nothing that's hate speech. You're just saying, I think they're responsible. Now you could think that's wrong, but it's very strange that they're now saying like that somehow immediately translates to hate speech
I think
it's
Donald,
crazy.
I think Donald Trump was in on 9/11.
Right. You know what I mean?
You know
It's
what
the
I'm
same
saying?
point.
I
It's like,
seriously do. Like there's some good evidence to suggest that Donald Trump was involved. So there you go.
Well, there was the whole real estate angle.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, he was very proud of the
insurance.
fact that his building was now the tallest building that morning on that radio
that's
interview.
gross.
Have you seen that?
No.
It's like he's like this like a local news broadcast. He's like, yeah, I was talking to Larry Silverstein. He's a friend of mine, good friend of mine. And when you look out there now, my building is the tallest building out there. It's like,
We decided to pull it.
Okay,
Let's just pull it.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Oh man. Well, and I mean, also we have the which aspect was that? Well, it's not. It's kind of off the shoot, but there. I think. Oh well, I think that one of them was that Rudy Giuliani, who's just connected to Trump very clearly, was like very much involved.
Exactly. That's another. Yeah.
I'll just share very quickly that I worked at it was called the Top of the Sixes. It was the 666 building, 666 at the 666 Fifth Avenue.
Is that the one that
which was another Silverstein building?
Was that the one that Jared Kushner bought? Or is that
I
a different
think they did
666
buy it,
building? Yeah.
Nice.
But it was another Silverstein building.
Oh, got it.
So that during that, when that whole theory was starting to circulate and surface, a lot of people at my work were talking about it because
is it? I mean, so you're talking about the pull it part?
Right.
Is that like the theory you're talking about the pull it part?
Right. Because
it's weird.
Insurance, yeah.
So I mean, that's not a theory.
Buy the insurance that's shortly before.
Can we acknowledge though that it's not a theory?
No.
Like he did not say pull it in regard to removing people from the building.
No.
Like there's just, I mean, I guess. What do you think? Am I wrong about that? I think that's a very obvious reality that they decided to just to control demolition of the building.
He knew that there were explosives in the building. He paid and
and we have the Alaska study that proves that, right? That they were, it had, anyway, we've all talked about these things a million times, but yeah, that's,
but
important.
If you think it was Osama bin Laden, don't you believe it for a second?
Yeah, right. And so that brings back to the main point of why that letter would then be taken at face value.
Exactly.
It's very interesting.
It's very, very interesting.
So I will include Glenn's tweet about this just to make, because we didn't actually address this yet, even though this is the kind of impetus for it, that the Guardian deleted the document, which makes me even more so think that they wanted, like the Streisand effect.
Yeah.
They want, and so that was like, I'm so suspicious about this. And so he just simply says, ever since October 7th, we've been urging people to recall the lessons of 9/11, not just U.S.'s huge errors responding, but why it happened. Bin Laden's letter blaming U.S. violence in the region, including U.S. support for Israel, went viral on TikTok, so the Guardian deleted it. Right. So it's and now trying to contort this, as you made the point, into something very different than what it seems the reality is. So it's very fascinating. So I'll include these links that Scott was pointing out. That Bin Laden says he wasn't behind the attacks, as well as the PDF. You guys can look at for yourselves. Very interesting. Yeah. So let's go into, which I actually do feel like there's some connection to these two topics in general, like the idea of January 6th, the idea of framing you, America, as the enemy, as the bad guy, the domestic terrorist, which I very much think was sort of the real reason behind a lot of this stuff, to kind of build the security state. I mean, that's not a hard sell for most people, right? No. So let's get into the discussion of January 6th. So go ahead and set this up and we'll get into some of the clips.
Yeah. So they've now released some more footage from January 6th that
shout out to Truth in Media, Ben Swan and Laura Logan. They're doing really good work on that.
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, I was not at the Capitol. I was at the Ellipse, and from the very beginning, everything felt like a setup. I'll just preface with that. Anybody who was actually a Trump supporter was not at the Capitol because he was still speking at the Ellipse at the time when all of this was going down. But when you first started to look at some of the videos that started to surface, I'm not necessarily proud of this, but I spent a lot of time in clubs in New York City. And, I dated people who worked in the club industry, and I spent a lot of time, I've been to VIP rooms and whatnot. And this is very much what those videos reminded me of. It was like there's velvet ropes and they escort people in. And they kept talking about an armed insurrection. I'm like, what are they armed with? Cell phones? This is
broomsticks and cones and stuff like that.
Flags. Like this is interesting. And it really did look like they were being escorted into the VIP room for a scenic tour. That's what it looked like. Right. And so now with these new videos surfacing, that becomes even more apparent. That you had the cops, it looks like they were totally inclusion. They're fist bumping afterwards. Right. So we'll see the clip. But I also thought that, I personally do think that it was, as you're saying, it's to frame to set up the police state. It is to scare people into questioning any authority, into challenging any government rulings,
protesting in general,
which is our First Amendment right? People often don't know the whole enumeration of the First Amendment. They think about freedom of speech, but it is freedom of speech, the right to peaceably assemble, the right to redress grievances. People seem to have very much forgotten that one.
Right.
And then the other one is, of course, and it is in the First Amendment, is freedom of religion. Unfortunately, that has very much been conflated to freedom from religion these days. It is not freedom from religion, it's freedom of religion. But that is the full First Amendment. I paraphrased, obviously.
Right.
But I think it is very much to have people shy away from engaging and embracing the First Amendment, which is their right to peacefully assemble, and to frame people as being insurrectionists, and that they're now criminals. And I think, we see Owen Schroyer is in jail. We see...
Is he still in jail?
Yeah.
That's so crazy.
Yeah.
It's so crazy.
Yeah.
My friend Sarah Mackby, you guys were at Cause Fest. She spoke. Her husband, who was a police, who was literally helping. I've heard these stories of there were people who were praying and they instigated them, like swatting their wrists, and these people got arrested. They were instigated, and only for just because they reacted like, oh, what are you doing? I mean, if somebody comes out of left field and starts, pounding your wrist, like, you're going to be startled. And they took that as somehow an infringement or a brutality, and arrested these people. So it does really just look like a huge setup. And I think it ties in also. So one of the other clips that I pulled up was about this neo-Nazi group.
Right.
That is
Blood Tribe.
Yeah, the Blood Tribe, who apparently this Christopher Powellhouse is, I'm probably mispronouncing his name, I apologize.
Polehouse. I've heard it both ways.
Yeah. He's also part of the Goyim Defense League.
Yep. I was going to make a point about Phantom Truth, who's out there with him. We talked about this already, actually.
Okay.
I think we did, actually.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's right. Yeah. So I feel like it all goes hand in hand. It very much ties to the Osama bin Laden, because to me, I just think they're setting up dialectical traps left and right, and it's all to stoke tensions, because they want people to be trapped in these wizard circles, so that you can't step outside, you can't see clearly. There's just this foggy haze over everything. And what happens when people are confused? They're destabilized, they become demoralized, and then they cling to anything they possibly can. And unfortunately, a lot of times they cling to these narratives that polarize them and further stoke tensions and further breed chaos, which is another breeding ground for usurpation of power. So
right. Well, I think, to one point is that, kettling itself is Derek has covered this a lot, is almost designed to create a reaction to then justify more violence. And you're just like encircling people. What are they going to do? It's like it's happened many times. But I think it's so obvious. And I think, in my opinion, even before the release of these videos, or before Truth in Media's breakdown of a lot of things we also didn't see, I was already, in my opinion, like, this is a government operation. And it doesn't mean everybody involved or not. Now, I don't think we should mince any words. I think it's very obvious and provable that this was a setup. And I think that doesn't then remove the accountability for somebody who may have committed a crime, however severe, like breaking a window and so on. It's a crime, minimal, ultimately, with what we're talking about. But the point is that still it was allowed to happen or driven to. And I think that's an absolute fact.
I think in many cases it was goaded. Yeah,
absolutely.
Absolutely set up. And I think that the other point is why I think it's connected. I think this Blood Tribe is, I think there's a lot of evidence pointing towards this being some sort of a federal operation, whether it be CIA or FBI or the two in collusion.
Again, I think we can prove this. And I think that we'll get into it when we get to that second part of it. But the idea, as we've been talking about, the vanilla ISIS or MAGA trap, as I've called it, and the overlap with the Project Aerodynamic and the Ukrainian Azov movement. I've tied both Christopher Polhas, the one behind him called Boneface, directly to that organization. And so this is a CIA setup. I mean, that's what it is. So. And so that doesn't then mean everybody there is part of it. No. Because as we all know, there are racists and there are bad people. Yeah. But the point is, I agree with you.
And unfortunately, they get pulled in as useful idiots.
Yeah, right. But I agree with you. I think that is a very clear, I'll show you the tweet that I put out today, where it's like, oh, what do you know? We start showing January 6th as a setup, and the vanilla ISIS gang gets marched out the same day. It just happened. God. And it's like, it's embarrassing. But so let's get into some of your clips here you wanted to share.
Sure.
So you want to just play them, or you want to set it up at all?
Yeah, you can
Okay,
play it. I think
so
we set it up.
This one, Michael Tracy says, January 6th defendants have long argued that the initial entrants were peaceably, escorted into the building by Capitol Police. As I think we all know and have seen many times, and therefore had no reasonable expectation their conduct was unlawful. And here's one of the things that has been released. And to your point, we've seen the velvet ropes. I mean, we've seen so many of these already, but it's just one more that's very hard to ignore.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, the people are going to point to like the gate outside, that they pushed back, but we have evidence there showing that there was multiple sides where they moved the gates and let them through, right? So why would an average person who doesn't realize they're involved with what they would be later called a insurrection, why would they think they're breaking the law?
Exactly.
Just wandering in, cops are waving at them in some cases.
Totally.
So crazy.
Filming. I can't hear whoever's filming this. I can't hear what they're whispering in the background.
I know.
That's a blue-haired person.
So
wrong protest that day.
yeah, wrong one. Antifa was the other. Yeah.
That's basically it.
Yeah.
You see many examples of the cops kind of nodding and waving back, and just the fact that they're just standing there very clearly does not implicate that they're under an insurrection. That they're about to get overthrown. Which is not to say that there weren't elements. We can now prove, again, via Truth in Media, that Ray Epps was very clearly telling Baked Alaska, we're here to go to, I think the word he used was go into the Capitol or some kind of the point was he's now denied that was what his objective was.
Right.
But he's on the record now stating this is our objective. It's just blatantly obvious.
Did I send the other one where the cops
I've got a few of them, yeah. So I don't know I don't necessarily the order, but
all those cops should be arrested for dereliction of duty for letting a crime happen right in front of them without responding.
If that's what they're claiming, sure, exactly. Right. Ooh, geez, that's graphic.
This was a different one.
So this one's go ahead.
It was like where they put paint.
The paintballs.
Paintballs. That's it. Yeah. To make it look like a bloody scene.
Is that what you think was happening? That's crazy. So either way, I read it more as like they're just trying to instigate them, but you're right. If it was read it's interesting. It says here we see Capitol Police firing paintball guns and throwing grenades into and I believe they mean, the stun grenades into peaceful crowd of people. They did this to fire them up in this person's opinion. I would agree with that and get footage of an angry crowd. So here's the video on that one. There's
I am giving warnings about chemical munitions. I need the less than lethal team position above me to start deploying.
Wait, I missed it. Did you say chemical munitions? Is that what he just said? I didn't hear that the first time.
I didn't either.
I have given warnings about chemical munitions.
I've given warnings about chemical munitions. So
that's what it sounds like.
So again, I would actually point out though, with a lot of these videos, it's hard to be able to confirm that the audio is in fact actual, right? Because anybody can fake it. So keep that in mind. But that's interesting. What would they mean by chemical munitions? Like I would argue like a stunt, like a smoke tear gas,
maybe, or
I think that's what they kept saying, that there was.
Spray.
Well, there was a lot of reporting about tear gas, right?
From the government.
Yes.
Right, but you're right too, though. There's arguments that they were using bear spray or pepper spray, so maybe they're saying warnings to you using that.
Yeah.
Who knows how to take it?
Antifa bottles full of piss and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, good times.
About chemical munitions. I need the less than lethal team position above me to start deploying. Launch.
Let me remove this. It says peaceful protester Joshua Black shot with a yellow rubber bullet.
You're on the wrong side. Hey, walk up to the front of the fucking line. Come here. Show these cops what they just did to you.
Man.
I know.
You gotta turn around. We need more fucking munitions. Let's go. Fucking shoot it. Go. Shoot. We're up here trying to get through the gate.
And no, this is really damaging. It's right close to you.
Yep, they're deploying flashbangs on us.
And realize where they are. You can't really call that anything other than a protest. You're allowed to assemble right there. And I don't mean necessarily because of other actions you could call violence, but just the idea that they're standing there. The argument is that they're doing this because they've already deemed it a riot, even though that's not yet happening. course, the fat guy's firing the rounds from back behind the crowd. That's crazy. And what's interesting on the overlap here too is we have all these examples of
they're shooting into their own people.
Like Jews for Peace example, like protesting in front of the Capitol, you know, and then because of the way that they were framed, calling them violent, even though the police in most cases initiated the violence to remove them. But Black Lives Matter has done 1,000 protests where they block entry in streets, and it's just so contradictory all over the place.
Whatever furthers the narrative,
right?
Supported.
Jeez, look at those. Oh, man, look at that. See, right there, that's a good example right there. How do you think you can justify that? Lobbing that into a crowd full of people that aren't, you know, there's children and families that are in the middle of that, not right up the front, maybe pushing, but look where he lobs this thing. Jeez, look at that. Look at how far he threw that. My God. And that's a different one. That's a rubber ball. That's more, that's cheese.
23 up here, Pier 43 on the north side of I Street. Very large crowd coming down I Street. 51, I need you here, please.
He's just having a good time.
And let's not forget that the reason they're all even pushing right there and starting to shove, that all really started where they pushed past it when Ray Epps came up and was like, look for that guy, and then they pushed in. Grenade happy, this guy. Man, look at that. Wow. That is so damning.
He's making you can feel like he's like all clean.
Yeah, he's like, loving it.
Yeah.
CS, that's it. Keep going.
Stinger grenade. See, and there's something being thrown, right? Yeah. From inside the crowd, but at this point,
who was here and who has custody of these 44,000 hours of videos, I can attest there were acts of violence. There were acts of terrible violence that day. Even from what I had seen with my own eyes and through the media, I've seen acts of
he pushed him off. Oh wow, I didn't see that.
That I had not seen before, and it was brutal and it was ugly.
Yeah, he was.
So the man speaking is addressing the police violence. Interesting. Look at that.
And through the media,
wow.
I've seen acts of violence against police officers that I had not seen before, and it was brutal and it was ugly. And our officers on the line did what they needed to do at the time.
I think the guy was speaking about the violence being done to police officers, but they're framing that over the image of them committing violence. Because I think he said that the officers did what they had to at the end of that.
Yeah.
Either way, the point is what we saw was very clear.
Chucking grenades at us.
Wow. I just think we're past the part right there. Just the grenades into the middle of the crowd.
If they'd never thrown the concussion grenades, if they'd never used the pepper spray, this wouldn't have happened. It was a peaceful protest. I was standing within 15 feet of the line of officers. They started firing at us before anybody did anything to them. We were not rushing them. There was no advance on them. They just started throwing concussion grenades and pepper spray.
Wow.
They've been tear gassing us.
I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe.
I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe.
Pretty crazy. So, I mean, it's interesting this is coming out right at this time, you know, where like, you know, Trump is getting, you know, indicted and all this crazy stuff. And it's like, I think they're building up the tension again, right? Because
they have to. There's an election.
Exactly.
Election season.
So they got to vindicate all the people for January 6th. They got to get them having that indignation, that justifiable indignation for, oh yes, we were right all along. And so now when the Democrats win in 2024 again, I don't even want to know what's going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. Look, to be clear, and I know we all agree with this, they have very legitimate grievances with being stolen from elections, being manipulated, which happens on all sides. We need to understand that. But you're right. It's already kind of being cultivated to create I think the point would be no matter what happens, the other side's going to say they stole it. And this has been a common tactic now around the world.
I think the point you're raising, Scott, is a very valid one, though. What they really, really want is violence.
Yep.
Right.
And so I think that, this was really arguably a peaceful protest that was incited. Arguably, a lot of the violence was coming actually from government officials, government police, and not from the people who were protesting. But what they're trying to do now is to get people, I think that this stuff is now being leaked through to incite those so that, yes, they do feel vindicated, but also so that they feel justified in standing their ground, and they're hoping, which I think is going to fall flat in terms of their efforts. But I think they're hoping that people will be so angry and so upset that there will be some sort of violence incited.
Right. The violence they wanted that time, like an actual violent armed insurrection.
Actual insurrection, and they didn't get it. So now I think they're trying to stir it up again in the hopes that they will get that before the election. My thought, and I don't know that they'll, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think they really want to declare some sort of martial law. They're doing everything possible not to have an election. I don't
think
know
that though? That's an interesting point. Go ahead.
I don't think they'll be successful, but I think they would like to get to a martial law or some sort of, totalitarian usurpation of power where they can declare that there's either a war and they have to, lock everybody down. There's another pandemic, the war. There's just too much violence, and for the, the domestic terrorists are taking over. And
all for your interest.
Yeah, it's all for your safety, your security, and they're throwing whatever they can and seeing what sticks. I think this is why I'm always saying, please don't play a violent reactionary.
Yes.
Whatever you do, do not, do not silence yourself. Do not muzzle yourself. Don't engage in auto critique. That was what the Mao struggle session did, and that did not work out well. So I don't encourage that, but don't get violent. Don't play that reactionary.
Well, as Scott Ritter recently said, though, and I'm not even saying you necessarily need to get angry, but being angry or even hostile, speech is speech. Understand that. So I agree with you 100%. Don't act in violence. I mean, look, there's plenty of, in my opinion, valid points where your family's being attacked, defending yourself, right? But in the sense, there's reasons to get upset. But acting in violence gives them the opportunity to pretend you were always the one causing the violence. And it's just this constant thing we're seeing. It really is just nonstop in every agenda everywhere, it seems, And so we have a couple more clips on here that I think are important that are, where was the next one? I think this is really kind of the same point. So we could probably this one just says it's because it all shows Capitol Police literally holding doors open for them. Exactly. So you guys can see it right there. Very clear.
It's just the beginning parts. You see that.
Yeah. And then I found there's a couple that I wanted to include here as well that just show interesting deviations. And this is what I think speaks more to whatever you think happened, that there was an element of them trying to cultivate a perception to show people, right? And the whole Pelosi side of this, or what they were doing inside in their war room, it was very, very, even her daughter, I believe, was on the record admitting, right? We have that video too, not today, but that this was not basically that what we were told wasn't the reality. Right. So here's an interesting clip that basically shows that what you're going to see is two different things at the same exact time we're told. One includes Grassley in the image and the other one doesn't. Even though it's both hearing and both, play acting the same moment when they heard Mike Pence say something.
Grassley, that's our guy, right? Tennessee.
They're not. They're none of them are my guy.
So we have a Senator Grassley here in Tennessee who's super based.
Yeah, we do.
So take note of what Pence is saying on the phone. That's the part that's where we'll bring it together. So the exact sentiment, and right here you only see Schumer and Pelosi. And see at the top, this is the 6th committee, so this is legitimate.
understanding with the chief of the U.S. Capitol Police, he just informed me is that they believe that the House and the Senate will be able to reconvene in roughly an hour.
So what you're seeing right there is the CNN version, right? But the other video that they're actually playing at the January 6th committee that doesn't show Grassley. So how do you explain that unless they recorded this twice?
Right.
This is we're being set up. I mean, whatever element it is, right? And so that's what the graphic says in the middle, just to make it clear. Exact same recording, two different shots, right? And that's wild. One with Grassley, one without. And it just plays it again. You know, I just, there's so many examples like this. And this is what I think is, you know, even before we had all this stuff, we had this kind of obvious, you know, we could tell that we were being manipulated. Liz Churchill adds that we go under, this was the clip of them. Just, this actually is pretty important too. And again, we've already got versions of this elsewhere. This is just one more where he literally is admitting that police were actually there as Antifa members.
Go undercover as the Antifa in a crowd. So can you put that back in?
Just we go under, you know, and we know this happens. They've been caught doing this already.
Better?
This just adds to that.
You guys get sprayed.
Undercover as Antifa.
That's really the main point right there.
Well, we go undercover as the Antifa in a crowd. So
that's just so crazy to me because it's, you know, these are things they would never admit, but it's all coming out with their release of the information. Yeah. Now, I would like to also add that there's things that are like, my point is, you know, we can't verify that that's exactly what he said, right? So we should question that. But my point is we already know and have proven that they do that. And that's been made clear. But there are things like this that are being recirculated that we know aren't true. So just wanted to caution people from believing every January 6th video a la Twitter files, right? We got to be careful. But you guys have probably seen this, right? This was put forward as real, but it's very, very much not real. And I think it's pretty clear, but they're now circulating as more evidence. It's just kind of funny. I think it was this one.
I'll now show you this video and let you decide for yourself what really happened on that fateful day.
Listen, sweetheart, let the men handle it.
Are you even listening to me?
Why don't you let me finish?
Congressional staffers were almost killed. I thought I was going to die.
This is an adult discussion.
The public doesn't fear us anymore, and you better do something. Oh,
what am I supposed to do?
Do your fucking job, Nancy.
Alexandria, let's break.
It's like play acting from some show, you know, let the men handle this. Like, you know, maybe it's real, but I just don't believe it for a second. And it's been shown to be fake.
That was absurd.
But what's funny though, is this is what's happened. It's not just this one post, but people are sharing and saying, you know, this obviously this is the Matt Gaetz press release kind of parody, but people are sharing this like it's real. And they did last time too. And then lastly, I just want to point out,
you know, AOC's brother did submit to a casting call for Congress. So she's proving her not so great acting chops there.
Yeah, exactly. I think they're all play acting half the time.
Yeah. But I think it's funny that he literally did answer an ad for her.
Right. Revealing it. Yeah. So this is, I'm not familiar. He follows me. I didn't know that. Independent journalists, seen him, Jordan Peterson, Russ Brand, so on. He just says, my mind is rapidly changing about January 6th. The new video footage, damn. Just wanted to show that there are people out there that had a different opinion that have now seen these and gone, and all the point that I think is important there, other than people have now are seeing it, that so many people, even people that we might argue have an interest in genuinely finding the truth, that just don't see it. That these things are out there and we cover it, and that for some reason it's not in their chamber, you know, and it's weird that people, even though they want it, you know, and so they just happen to see it. They go, whoa, even though this has been circulating, how long, you know, from the very beginning of this. I just find that very, very interesting. So that brings us to your next point. Oh, go ahead, Scott.
No, I said that's very cool. Interesting. Yeah.
And this is about the, go ahead. I'll let you frame it.
So there's these neo-Nazi groups, the Blood Tribe. And I really was not very familiar with this at all, but apparently they're like literal neo-Nazis with swastikas and it looks like, so when you start investigating, there's some very interesting ties. And he's got this connection to this Fred Emery is his name, I think. They co-own property together. Because with all these things, you always have to wonder who's funding it.
Right.
Exactly. So it's like, and they both have these federal criminal records. So now it does really, to me, look like some sort of a federal operation. And if that's the case, you have to wonder who's going to be an asset, a likely asset. Now, people who have some sort of criminal records are more susceptible because there can be plea bargains that are made in exchange for becoming an operative. So, yeah. So, I feel like this is just all really interesting in the timing, because I think they're trying to set up these different, again, just further dialectical narratives. And yeah.
Yeah, I think this is really important, actually. And so it comes into another topic that we've all discussed already. And this is the idea of, I mean, again, even in the broad term, just using people that may not even know they're being used, but some cases I think I can prove we do know that they're an asset, but that using this to justify the war on domestic terror, the war on white supremacy, while they're literally funding white supremacists and Nazis, like just completely not honest. But I think, and so first I thought this was interesting. And I do think the reason you sent this was the point that, this is one example of how this gets used against us, especially if it is all a construct that now and I made this point earlier, even about the Maine aspect, but also like the protesting aspect. They're trying to shut down things in Maine because they're there. And this was they may be prohibited from owning firearms. The point is that this is about in every way trying to use these people that we can prove are connected to some sort of an agenda to control what we can do, what we can say. Right. I think that's the simplest point to it.
And I think that was the whole point of the setup for January 6th. And that's why they're targeting all these political prisoners, is so that they're setting an example of them, so that none of us question things, none of us engage in our First Amendment right to peaceably assemble, to do protest, and that will all it's to further advance their not so patriotic act which is really just a installment of a surveillance and police state where we don't have the right to question anything, to redress grievances, or to assert our freedoms. Right.
And what's interesting is that this stems right off the back of that's what I pointed out today. So all this January 6th information comes out, which reveals that this whole massive push and let's not forget, by the way, that and this was proven, even admitted in congressional sessions, that every single individual investigation, whether or not they had any reason to believe that they were dangerous or white supremacists or domestic terrorists, after January 6th was then labeled as domestic terrorist investigation. And then they used that metric to say, we look at how many domestic terrorism investigations have expanded since January 6th. Well, they just chose to label every individual grandma they talked to as that. And so they're manufacturing this idea. So now it's being shown that even more so that this was not genuine, that it wasn't as bad as they said, and so on. So my point was, of course, more damning evidence begins to come out, continuing to expose the U.S. government continues to lie about January 6th, and without fail, the Vanilla ISIS gang gets marched out. And we've been covering this for a while, the idea of, the Patriot Front, which is one of these versions, all dressed. Here's what's really done.
Which has also been proven to be,
every one of them. Patriot Front, Blood Tribe, these groups have direct ties to things like the Waffen Division, which has directly connected to the Azov movement. So you can see funding directed right back to the CIA and Israel, for that matter, in regard to the Azov movement. But what's interesting is the Patriot Front, dressed in their khakis and basically exactly what FBI look like, which is hilarious. But then, the point somebody made earlier is, oh, well, look, now they changed their khakis, but it's the exact same outfit. Are we supposed to pretend like that's not obvious? Like, it's really strange. So they marched them out, and it says an extreme neo-Nazi group called the Blood Tribe has been spotted marching in the streets, and this is in Wisconsin. So it's interesting. So it's now deviated from Maine, but it's the same group. So I think what's important to this is, well, I've labeled this previous one from September. CIA is creating, fostering, and seeding neo-Nazi extremists into the United States for the very purposes we just discussed. And I think what's alarming about it is that we could tie this right back to their agenda. And you shared this one. Neo-Nazi groups spew hate outside Disney World and are near Orlando. And all of this is also spinning up this argument that there's rising anti-Semitism and there's every part of these angles, and it's being used to censor right now on Twitter and everywhere else too.
Absolutely. And of course, this whole rising anti-Semitism, I think is definitely designed also to create more polarization. I showed a really interesting video of a former Green Beret who was talking about asymmetrical warfare. And he was talking about, theories about Hamas and what's happening in Gaza. And he was saying how, of course, and we've talked about this, obviously, it doesn't make sense that the IDF wouldn't recognize, the attacks. But he said that it also, they don't have the same militaristic capacity
Mhm.
that say Israel has,
Right.
or that Israel, with our support would have, certainly. So they would have to use an asymmetric kind of a tactic. And one of the tactics that has been used, Vietnam is a great example of this,
Mhm.
but we've seen this throughout history, where instead of necessarily kinetically targeting, they will target the narratives to pervade throughout the West
Mhm.
and infiltrate through the academic institutions, the media. And so you're seeing all these what look like very militant pro-Palestinian rallies that are cropping up everywhere,
Mhm.
particularly in universities. And they look very similar to the BLM riots that happened, right? In terms of their organization. And my point in all of this, though, is that the narrative that they're trying to set, I think, is that there is this, pervasive, just overwhelming anti-Semitism that is, and that we have to target that. We have to, so that now you have both sides. And of
Right.
course, what does that do? It now then makes the pro-Palestinian people, the Muslim people, or the Muslim sympathizers even more enraged. Like, no, they have to, they're going to be further entrenched in their beliefs and their mission. And then, of course, it makes all the people who are Israel sympathizers, or or Jews in general, or people who are sympathetic to that cause, are going to further feel like they have to defend. So now what do you have? You have further tensions, and they don't even have to have a kinetic war, because now the people are going to fight each other. But this was a very long-winded way of saying, I think this is part of that, because this is,
I agree.
This is further instigating and showing, hey, look, we have a real problem.
Right.
Look at these neo-Nazis. The anti-Semitism has gone completely out of control.
So are you suggesting that your point you made, that's Israel doing that? Or is that because you're suggesting the Soros part of it, right?
See, this is the thing that I think, this is just my opinion. I think a lot of people, everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, but a lot of people, this is just human nature. We want to pin the tail on the donkey.
Right.
And we want to be like, there's the boogeyman. We'll put all the blame on them. But oftentimes what happens is you have these people who are vying for power, and, they oftentimes they end up working together because they have common enemies and common interests. So sometimes they go rogue and they have their own competing interests, but oftentimes they will, it looks very much like they're working concomitantly, and in conjunction with one another. And sometimes they are, and sometimes it's just that they're all advancing the same agenda because it serves their interest.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So I don't think it's just, I think there's a lot of facets at play, which is part of why this is so complicated.
Let me reframe it differently.
Yeah.
Are you suggesting that is being done in the interest of Israel's agenda, or the Western agenda? Or are you suggesting that is some other side of the narrative?
No, I actually don't think this is necessarily pro-Israel. I think this is...
how would that serve the interest then? That's what I'm confused about, because if you want to make them look bad...
The interest is to advance towards the New World Order.
Right.
The interest is the internationalist world order. And I know I'm a broken record because I keep bringing this book up, but it really outlines this so beautifully. Is Eon Matu's Milner-Fabian conspiracy. And, they talk about the whole, how things were set up. He draws a lot from the work of Carol Quigley and Anthony Sutton. So, of course, we go through the World Zionist Federation and how the British intelligence used the Zionist movement to set up Israel as an outpost for their militaristic aspirations. However, then the second half of the book also talks about the agenda of the Islamification of the West and how that would help advance, because there's a lot of parallel ideology between the Islamists and the internationalists and the totalitarians in general.
Yeah.
And then, of course, what better scenario for these people than to have them fight each other?
Right.
And that's really, so the argument I'm making is that I'm not saying there aren't people who have pro-Israeli interests at heart and pro-Palestinian or that there aren't people who are vying for each of those factions. But I think there are people who I would argue are superseding them, who are pulling the strings on both sides because they don't have either interest at heart. They're vying for a world governance body that they control.
Interesting.
And they're vying for world power.
Yeah. Now, I didn't mean to make you qualified. I think just back to the simple point, I think is a very valid point. Interesting is that, we have an example of where I think we all agree that there is, whether it's this topic or anything else, where you've got entities who manipulate protests or create them, and if we all know this, it's not just Soros either. It's all over the place, right? So my point is, what I'm getting at is interesting that we can, at least for whatever their intent, people are, what you're arguing is that they are seeding like what I think the word you used was radical. I forget the word you used. These pro-Palestine protests. But I would wonder, why can we consider that might be in and of itself part of that agenda, that we're, as opposed to seeding the extremist protest, just simply framing any pro-Palestinian protest as extreme, and it serves the same interest.
I think both are happening simultaneously.
I agree.
Yeah, I think both are happening.
It's just interesting that and as we all point out, and you get in the paradigm dynamic, as it's always all or nothing, and there's so much, there's nuance to all of these things.
And oftentimes, I talk about because of Cause House, I talk a lot about like culture creation and social engineering in the masses. And I think the mistake that people make is, again, this binary logic that always. There's no organic culture, or it's only it's only artificially injected, created culture. And oftentimes, actually, neither one is the case. Oftentimes what happens is, in very localized regions, you do have organic culture that crops up, right?
And they're always trying to use that too.
Exactly. And that's typically what happens, is that gets co-opted, manipulated, and expounded. So.
Yeah, no, fair point. I just think we have to consider all sides of this, and also, just to make it very specific, no one's saying that there aren't people on the side of Palestine. It's more complicated, but that are want to hurt Israelis or vice versa. Like, there are people that have been wrapped up, and to your point, probably radicalized by the very things we're talking about, not even knowing that. But I think it's important that we realize that, in my opinion,
Islam literally means to submit. So
But I think that the point, in my opinion, is that, and again, even going back, bringing this back to the point that brought this up in the United States, is that, but again, to the Palestine-Israel concept, is that there are predominantly, in my opinion, Israelis, the average population, that don't want negative things to happen to any civilians. And same thing with the Palestinian side. And we have this kind of game where they're playing on either side to frame them all as one thing. And we fall into these traps far too often. And the last point was bringing it back to the main thing, is that this is, in one case, what we're dealing with here in the United States is the same extension of that same illusion.
And I will just to address the civilians, because I mean that, of course, is a more encompassing kind of conversation with lots of nuances, but it is part of the.
I'm just going to point out, we're going to get to the Israel point to the end. So if you go ahead and make your point, but we can get into that specifically when we finish.
I was going to say that oftentimes, and this was where the Viet Cong was a really great example in the Vietnam War, because they knew they couldn't win kinetically, targeting their opponent, so they actually targeted their own civilians in order to create this narrative that they had been decimated, and to appeal to the sympathies. And I think that happens.
Oh yeah. I actually hadn't heard that. It wouldn't surprise me, but I would also then immediately, just because of my stance and my perception of how governments act, whether or not that in and of itself was something that was lied about then and committed by the U.S. government to justify what they were doing, and so on, just as one of the other possibilities. I've just always considered that, like, not to say that in any sense, I think any government anywhere in the world, if put to the point, would justify killing their own people or resistance groups within the elements of what we're talking about. I really don't think anybody should question that any group like this is capable of hurting their own people to achieve their own ends. We're watching it happen right now in many different ways, But so back to this, I think so in the U.S. dynamic, this is the point we've been always talking about the idea of the vanilla ISIS MAGA trap concept. And what that means, for those who don't remember, is that it's really coming down to using this, and even some cases leaning into actual, radical, however you want to frame it, ideals that are in that side of the argument, but getting them to then lean into it. That's what the insurrection was supposed to be. They wanted them to go in with their guns and then frame it. And, and to the points we've already made, it all leads into the bigger manipulation of our lives.
Sure.
And I think that, I think there was only one last. Oh, I just wanted to shout out Truth in Media in general for their work that they've been putting out these breakdowns of these very same things before the kind of all blunt release from the congressional thing. And they've been doing great work on this about Ray Epps and otherwise. And then just in general sense, I think that's important that we connect this with the bigger manipulation. And I guess on this last point, where do you guys think this goes before we get into the Israel focus on the conversation. Like,
sorry, I tied them all.
Oh no,
Yeah,
because they
no, I
connect.
think it's
They
good.
totally
Yeah.
connect.
Good.
I just wanted you to know that we will get into it so we can flesh that out even further. But where do you guys think this goes in general? You know, like why in Maine, in Wisconsin, you know, is it just as simple as trying to create the illusion that we're all white supremacists?
Yeah, I mean,
with the
they need to
government.
create the boogeyman, and they're just seeding more narratives. Like I'm surprised they haven't pulled off the big move yet, where it's
Right.
like martial laws, like they need
Yeah.
to, like Courtney was saying it earlier, like they're going to aim. That's the goal. You know, they want us to engage with them on their terms, which is through violence, and they want us to play on their on their level. And I'm just, we've been saying this for years, man. I thought it was going to happen in 2020. I thought it was going to happen in 2021, you know, and now here we are. It's the fever pitch is just increasing as it goes along. And it just feels like that's exactly what they're aiming for. And each one of these incidents that happen is just adding more fuel to the fire, really.
It is.
And I think it's such an interesting point to raise, because they really do, especially on this, the dialectical dissidents, right? Because they really do target it on both sides. When you bring up 2020, I remember that people kept advocating that Trump had all the grounds for martial law and for the Insurrection Act, and you know, and I remember hearing this, and of course it was from the political right, who claimed to be advocates of limited government and, you know, personal freedoms and states' rights, and here they were championing Trump to institute the Martial Law and Insurrection Act. And it is just so interesting, because I'm now seeing it again, you know, surface with often it's the same people. Of course, it's both sides. We you know, it's both sides, but that's really the point. And I'm seeing it again with these people now in the media, like the alternative media, who are talking about, well, what we really need is to have, you know, some sort of legislation on, and I'm seeing in all different types of things about things, you know, like speech, and it's like, okay, so when it served you, you want the government to make some sort of, I don't know, the federal government to make some blanket legislation. How on earth does this support American principles? Like, does not support personal freedom. This is not aligned with the Constitution. This is certainly as far removed from the Bill of Rights as possible.
Right.
And it is incredibly dangerous and a slippery slope towards totalitarianism. But I just wanted to point out that, you know, I think oftentimes people expect that from the left, but we see it on the right too. So
just as much, right? I mean, that's how the two-party paradigm works, right? You know, as you're saying, they see, and I'm not saying everybody involved in that decision that maybe they genuinely think they're in the right, you know, but I think that they have their justification, and then the other side goes, no, they don't believe in freedom. And then 4 years later, you know, 2 days later, and then the thing comes up over here, and they go, oh my God, you know, we have the justifiable reason, and they point back. And the only thing that happens is then over the next administration, or maybe sooner, we have the reality that they kind of just make the case that we need that.
Right.
And Americans fall for it, you know, and it's always one bad guy versus the other. It's just the way it works.
They're able to keep the pendulum swinging back and forth
every time.
Meanwhile, they're just amassing more and more power.
Yeah. Right. All right. Well, let's get into the conversation of Israel, Palestine. And I think I'll just play the beginning of this clip because it's long. I just thought it was interesting to bring this into the connection with the opening clip from Bill Cooper when we started with earlier, and about a statement he had about Zionism. And this is where I truly believe it's important to understand, as I see it, and what I think is kind of supported by a lot of the, you know, Orthodox Jewish community around the world that pushes back on this, not necessarily every Orthodox Jewish community, but that this is about Zionism manipulating Jewish communities in order to achieve their ends. And it's just interesting that this is what Bill Cooper was saying at the time.
Zionism. For behind Zionism is not Jewish. Folks, it's not the Jewish people. They're being used. They're going to be sorry that they're allowing themselves to be used. And if you're Jewish, you had better reject it. It's not about saving or preserving the state of Israel. It's about creating a one-world government and Orthodox Jews, along with fundamentalist Christians, or any Christian for that matter, who will not renounce Christ as a divine incarnate of God in the flesh upon this earth. Any follower of the prophet Muhammad, anyone who will not bow down to this new religion will be destroyed. Will be destroyed. Whomsoever believeth in me shall have everlasting life.
Very interesting. So that's just Bill Cooper making a point that we talk about often, you know, and what any thoughts on that?
I do, yeah. So I think, you know, we talked a little bit in last time, and this is definitely a rabbit hole that I rejected going down for a long time because I had a lot of my own cognitive dissonance.
You mind if I ask, is it because you felt that it was like a racist association, or what was the resistance? Because I think that's what a lot of us felt, that we were worried we were falling for some, whatever else.
Well, I mean, I think, none of us are impervious to programming and propaganda and conditioning. And of course, I know I talk about this all the time. One of the main goals that I think the Frankfurt School was very successful in doing was to create this identity for Jewish people around the Holocaust, right? They attached their identity to being victims of the Holocaust, and what the whole purpose of that was to make them victims, right? That was the purpose. And that was something that I found really interesting. It seems really tenable. Like it seems pretty obvious. It's pretty clear.
You're using one of the worst tragedies in history to manipulate people. Exactly. That's pretty messed up. Yeah,
it is absolutely. And I think about there in my own family, there's been tons of persecution. My great grandmother watched her father be sliced in half by the pogroms. This was long before the Holocaust. So my family were not Holocaust survivors. They actually all came here before the Holocaust due to other types of persecution. So there's been persecution of all types of races, all types of people, all types of religion throughout history. I do not condone any of them. I think that is atrocious.
Where do we have to say that?
Yeah, I mean, it's horrible. We have to say that. But I will say that because it's absolutely true. It is the worst aspects of humanity. And unfortunately, good people fall into it because of what I call the false compassion traps that are laid out. So anyway, just when you ask why was this hard for me to get into, because, it was presented many times, and certainly in 2020, it started surfacing a lot. And it very much, of course, my family does not like this. I was always told, the elders, the protocols of Zion, that's a whole lie. It was used as a false trope in World War II. But I really like to have, quantifiable information before I can adjudicate and make my decisions. So I have gone down this rabbit hole, and I can't remember who said it, but it was somebody who was saying Zionism is the most anti-Semitic thing possible. And I think that there's a lot of truth in that statement, because it is the same kind of thing where you're using, you're using atrocities and, devastating circumstances to victimize a group of people. And you're weaponizing it against the very people with using deceit. So in this case,
against Semites, which is interesting.
And Semite just mean people of that region.
Palestinians,
right? Yeah. So, it is, again, it's a very deceptive term, but, the people using it are not, they're not concerned about Judaism. They're not concerned about the state of Israel from a biblical perspective. This is being used very much to serve their own geopolitical aspirations. And I think that is, it's terrible. And it's horrible for the Jews who are being used as pawns.
Right.
And so much. And here's the other thing. What it does is it creates further hatred towards the Jews.
Right.
So
and
now,
towards Palestinians or other.
But when you ask about why is it very anti-Semitic? Why did I think that? It's because now you're now further making scapegoats out of them. You're making them into people who you're breeding further resentment. So now you're going to increase the anti-Semitism and the targeting of Jews for something that many of them aren't even aware has occurred. They don't even know the history behind it.
And go ahead.
I think one of the best ways to eliminate anti-Semitism in the world is just to have Jonathan Greenblatt just shut up, dude. And then all anti-Semitism will go.
Well, had he shut up, we wouldn't have found out that they have spies in groups in the United States. Did you hear that leak that came out?
No.
Greenblatt was caught on it. It was a leaked a conversation he had with his team, and it came out where he was saying, first of all, the point was about how it's not a left-right problem, which I think is important. And he's addressing what he frames as anti-Semitism, which I'm sure that includes some of it, but it also conflates anybody that's pointing out Israel and what they're doing and Zionism. But the point was, I'm constantly trying to show people it's not a left-right thing. It superseded this paradigm just like COVID did. But he said it's a young, old problem, which is interesting. But then he goes on to say, we have analysts inside these groups. Jews for Peace. He lists them off. My point is, think about how alarming that is. You're talking about a huge, wildly influential Israel lobbyist group that has spies inside of American protest groups. That's terrifying to me. Anyway, I just think that's an important point. But yeah, shut up.
Just shut up. Like who elected this guy? Like the spokesperson for the entire Jewish population?
Their own group is saying he's hurting the group.
Yes, exactly. The ADL in general.
Well, I would say
dude.
when you say like an old young problem, what I very much see is they very much targeted like the liberal Jews to promote the one agenda, and then they very much targeted the neocons, and both of them I think are have been fed lies and that don't serve Jewish people at all.
Yeah, right, exactly. Well, so let's get into some of these points. Oh, actually, I forgot that. I'm just going to skip these because of time in general. I think we only got 15 minutes left. So I just wanted to include these. I'll throw them so you guys can see them. A mask study that I just want to throw some COVID points just because that this is a new one. This is from this year, August. And it's funny when nobody heard about it, at least maybe I didn't see it. I look for these things still. Mask study published by NIH suggests N95 COVID masks may expose wearers to dangerous levels of toxic compounds linked to seizures. Conspiracy theory, censor them. They're crazy. Geez, almost like you heard this in 2020 from a lot of us. Or that a new study this month on the 18th, yesterday, vitamin D supplementation, shocking, reduced the rates of ICU admissions and mechanical ventilation needed for SARS-CoV-2.
Just vitamin D.
What do you know? It's almost like we heard that in 2022.
Yeah, there were clinics getting raided by the FDA at gunpoint for doing this type of treatment.
Right. You had the actual NIH pushback on that, even though Fauci said that in the beginning in regard to just respiratory viruses, but how ridiculous. Or a new COVID variant, by the way, weirdly HVI, almost like HIV, I said that was funny, is now dominant. These are the most common symptoms. What do you think they are? Sniffles and cough and any other ubiquitous symptom you can possibly align it with. But I'm not even, I think it's to consider. Maybe it's going to be rolling back out. Dr. Malone put out a point in the International Crisis Summit in Romania. They basically admit, per the EMA in Europe, that these shots were never, ever authorized to stop transmission or to stop infection. And they from the very beginning, and they lied about it this whole time. They knew that. But again, no big surprise to this audience. We all knew these. But think how crazy that is. Now they're quietly admitting these things as fast as they can.
Exactly.
So crazy. Well, I wanted to start on this point in general and to just make sure we saw something developing that was really interesting. I shout out to Brock Ravid, who I'm not familiar with, but I saw it here first, which is that Biden is now warning, which I think indicates the gap that's widening between what Israel's doing and the partners they have that are uncomfortable that the world seems to be starting to push back on this in regard to just the ongoing attacks that are hurting civilians specifically. Not that nobody's ignoring what happened on October 7th, but we will get to some more points that seem to undermine the breadth of what actually happened. Not that Hamas didn't commit crimes, but Biden warns U.S. could sanction Israeli settlers who attack Palestinians. I believe it's almost upwards of like 200 people now that have been killed in the West Bank, and there's children being killed. And it's crazy. The fact that Biden says he wants to sanction individual settlers, like that's even going to do anything, seems pretty silly to me. But I think it's more about setting the stage to be like, look, we're trying to do something because it's sending Netanyahu a message. I think we're going to begin to do more of this if you keep going. It's been revealed that they've been pushing back against what they've been doing pretty much the whole time. Not that I think they care, but it's politically bad for them, I think. And feel free to chime in if you want, if you have thoughts, guys. I'm going to just go through this quick for 15 minutes left. Caitlin says last month. Oh, I just want to include these. We have a lot of people, actually, this should have been over here, I think, but a lot of people now beginning to say that they were standing up and pointing at the evidence that was there post October 7th, that the IDF was involved to whatever degree you think, there was some of it shooting their own people. And the point is now it's being revealed by Haaretz. Shout out to Dr. Strangelove is where I saw it, but here is the Hebrew version, which is not in English, of course. And I think that none of the Western media has touched on this yet. Assessment in the security system, which I don't know. The headline is hilarious to me that their point they're trying to make. Hamas didn't know about the festival in advance. I don't even know why that's a relevant point, but in the subtitle, it was also shows that the military helicopter that fired at terrorists apparently also hit some revelers. And further in the article as well, it goes on to point out very explicitly that but we don't need this to tell us that. It's already been admitted by Israelis. It's been admitted by the security head at the kibbutz Ba'ere. It's been admitted by helicopter pilots that they were firing on cars that could have hostages. So that's crazy to me that now Haaretz, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it's happening on both sides. That this was really
the point certainly possible
earlier. I think they are unfortunately on both sides targeting their own civilians in order to play on the sympathies of external people.
When you say both sides, you talking about Hamas or all of Palestine?
Hamas.
Okay, well, but that's different than both sides here because Hamas is now it's become the framing of what Palestinians are doing. I just think that's an important distinction. So Hamas, I don't disagree. I have no doubt that they're capable of that. I have yet to see evidence of that, and that's important. But also, I think that what's important here is not to, as much as it's important to show that in this one point, that's sort of irrelevant because we're getting to the impetus of this and what they might have done and whether Israelis think they were involved. And now we're seeing that they're even admitting that they either didn't care about killing their own people or chose to. That's wild to me, but it's a fair point that I do agree that there's a lot. We should not take anything at face value from Hamas or the Israeli government because they're involved in what's going on. But man, if that doesn't then make you stand back and question what else is going on in this event, I don't know what else will, but that's wild to me. Now, and then Megatron just pointed out the same thing. Police investigation found that this military helicopter that fired at Hamas on the festival area apparently did hit some participants at the festival. That's a direct quote from Haaretz. And then the Cradle is following up because these are people that were trying to expose this at the beginning and being called conspiracy theorists. People like Aaron Mate, who broke this down early and they called him a conspiracy theorist. Syrian Girl, same thing. Max Blumenthal. One point I want to make that was funny. Mario Narfall, who I keep pointing out is this weird, I can't get a sense on whether he knows he's doing it or not, but so he looks at this article, even though you can read what he writes, and his breaking, Hamas was not aware. That's what you run with? I get, yeah, but sure. Ignore the huge point that they killed their own people. But, I don't know. I felt like pointing that out. I think that's funny.
Yeah.
And then her same thing for her. Just trying to rush through this. Now, the point in general is Efrat Fengenson also is following up on her investigation. She is in Israel. She was a former IDF intelligence officer. She said
great work.
She's doing, I don't agree with everything she's saying, but I greatly respect her work. The observers warned, the commanders ignored. If you continue to harass, you will be brought to trial. That is what it is. And I'll show you from their article themselves. That is the Israeli military telling people in the IDF who were trying to tell them before the 7th that something was coming. And they said, stop bringing this up. If you keep doing it, we'll bring you to trial. That's crazy. Now, she says, as time passes, more and more evidence accumulates, indicating early signs of the terror attack on the October 7th, which did not receive proper attention. New evidence exposes the depth of disregard and the threat to the observers who warned. That's crazy. The observers are not receiving close psychological support, and commanders demanded they return to duty or sign a waiver. Those observers felt that they weren't being listened to, that what they saw wasn't being taken into account. Some of them decided to report to one of the senior commanders in their division, and this was the response they received. I don't want to hear about this nonsense again. If you bother me again with these things, you will face trial. And then obviously said the 7th happened. Here's the article itself, which you can read it right in here. In interest of time, I'll include it. You guys can read it for yourselves. And then I wanted to point this out that now Israel, and guys, please feel free to chime in. I'm trying to go through it. Israel is now saying, rather Disclosed TV, but this is what's been going on since the 7th, by the way. Israel and the U.S. and Hamas are apparently close to an agreement that would free dozens of women and children held hostage in Gaza. And it says that's only exchanging for a 5-day pause, according to Washington Post. What's interesting, though, and I'm just kind of making a cheeky point here, but every time I brought this up online, which we have to remember, and I'll just go to this first, that they have stated publicly from the beginning that they don't want to negotiate until they remove it from power. So just so we understand the real context of this, and even Vice News reported just recently that they were saying, no, we want to start the ground offensive before we even begin, and they make it clear that this has been on the table. The idea of this negotiation has been on the table since day one. The outline of the deal has not changed from the start of the talks in the past few days to appear more receptive. So Israel's after 40 plus days finally deciding, okay, now we want to consider exchanging for hostages. My point is, if they're saying we don't deal with terrorists, clearly that's what they're beginning to do. And I just find that kind of a contradiction point that every time I ask, why haven't they accepted an exchange? The narrative is we don't deal with terrorists. It's kind of funny to me. But overall, the point is they have repeatedly not chosen to engage in this process of exchange under the idea that they don't, but now they're beginning to, but that it shows to me without question that they care more about the agenda than the actual people that have been taken as the Israeli government. That's my opinion, but we can see that they made this point that they weren't going to negotiate until this. And so now we're coming to the point to where now, again, bringing it back, that we find out that they did in fact shoot their own people, and that now we're finding the evidence continues to show that they are allowing this to continue while people continue to get killed. I just find that to be very, very interesting. Now, one last segment, if you guys want to comment there before I go on to some of the other things I want to show you that I've seen that are showing to be false. Because it's just about the hostages. The idea that how can they continue to bomb an area where they know they're being held and act like they still care whether they come home? What are your thoughts on that?
Wasn't there something like that, like using hostages as political tools like that, like back in like the Reagan administration or whatever? Like, wasn't there like a hostage situation like Iran or something like that? And then they like held up. They intentionally didn't release them early so that it could affect an election. You guys know what I'm talking about? There was a situation like that.
Sounds kind of familiar, but I don't want to comment unless I remember exactly.
Yeah, it was a big controversy where it was like, I can't even remember the candidate, so I can't really speak to it. But yeah, it was the idea of like they had the opportunity to release hostages early, but there was an election coming up, and so they wanted to postpone the hostage release until the new president.
Iran or the U.S. government?
I think it was the U.S. government.
Okay, yeah.
So the U.S. government was like, and so then when the new president got into office, then he could release the prisoners and or the hostages and be the hero.
Right.
In that span of time, like several of the hostages were killed and stuff, and so there's a big controversy because like, oh, you guys could have released them early, but you wanted this political win. You don't have
to sell me on that. Yeah, I can't confirm because I don't remember exactly, but that's not a shock to me. I think that the governments do this kind of thing. That's my point, is that it shouldn't be shocking to anybody that they'd be willing, like for instance, Vietnam, Afghanistan. I mean, we could prove that they knew these things were not winnable and just maintained it. But Vietnam more obviously, but Afghanistan, same point. You know, you can prove that they just kicked the can down the road and let young people continue to die, knowing that they wouldn't actually gain anything from it. It's all politics, and that's how they see this. So my point is, I'm not saying every single element of everybody in the government doesn't care about them, but what's interesting is you can very clearly see the point just based the facts on the table. They've been offered multiple times in exchange that the UN, the US even pressured them to take it, and they said no. And that's why that article is important. Literally on the record, we won't negotiate with them for hostages until we remove them from power. Not because they had a bad deal. They just said, nixed it. No. How do you frame that as they care about these hostages? I just don't understand that. You know, I mean, maybe you could balance it as they perceive the Hamas threat to be so, you know, for all of the rest of the people in Israel, that this is more important. But my point is that right now you can go, you know, going back to EFRAT and everything else, the Israeli population don't want that. Polls, everything, even the corporate media, they're calling for ceasefire. They're protesting in front of Netanyahu's house. They're saying that you were responsible. You were part of this. You know, that's the sentiment. So it's a very weird dynamic that's going on. So to that next point, then I think what's interesting is to see how many things we now have to, I want people to see this as much as it's a very sensitive topic, that they have been caught lying about things like this. That doesn't mean that everything didn't happen, they say, but we have to understand, as again, the credit to Max on this, for breaking this down. This was on the 15th, where there was an image that we can prove. Here's just one of the examples, which is, it's, you know, caution. It's a horrifying image of a woman that appears to have been raped. And this is from March 2022. Okay. So, and there's examples going further back than that. My point is you can prove that Israel, or rather the site that they've endorsed and they've been pointing to, and it is managed by, you know, the element, this is the kind of the oversight of all of the things they said happened at this. And that's where all this information comes from. It's from Israeli screenings and so on, that this was included. Nova party victim raped and killed. And they had it on the website. Max broke it down, proving that it was an old image. I then caught yesterday or the day before that they then deleted it, which is here. This is the current version, which is now gone. So without any context, without any addressing, they just remove it. And that image has already been used by corporate media. From the very beginning, it was showed as the proof of this happening. So it just makes me very uncomfortable that we're in a position where you can have this kind of thing happening and nobody seems to be calling out. The corporate media, they're using it, don't address this. And it makes me very, you know, it angers me that we even have to get into it. Like I said on the show yesterday, it's not like I'm seeking out rape allegations to debunk. That's disgusting. You know, it's like I care about the truth. And it's very clear that some of these aren't true. That should give anybody pause. Right. So the last point was, this is one of the eyewitness accounts that are being shown around, where he goes on to specifically cite this exact image that he says he saw, that we know didn't happen there. Right. And that's very concerning to me, that now we have to wonder whether people are saying these things. Did they get put to that? I don't know. But he lists that exact image off, and we've seen many examples of that. And lastly, this was one of those examples. This is one of the guys that's saying he had the special screening, and he literally goes off lists the exact same, because the proof is we've already shown this is what Israel's been showing people, and that's why it's involved in these screenings. And my point is we can prove that image, amongst others, didn't actually happen there. It's an old image. And then just the other points that we went through this in general, breaking down their other graph, just so people understand both the things they've been showing at this new location or the Al-Shifa hospital, or any of these different things have been shown to be, even by BBC, even by CNN, are calling this out. Now, actually, just before we end, I know we have a couple minutes. Let me know if you have to go.
Yeah, we're getting down the wire, but yeah.
Okay, just what do you guys think about that? Why would you think BBC, CNN would begin suddenly going, I don't believe what Israel's saying? That's wild. If you haven't seen that, they both called out their video about whether or not this is real, what they found in the Al-Shifa hospital. Why do you think that would start happening? Because I'm not trying to trust the corporate media now, but it's like, is it because, well, go ahead. What do you think? Any thoughts on that?
That would be hilarious. Like, it's like along the same lines of us thinking Osama bin Laden's the good guy now. It's like if all of a sudden they can get us to believe the mainstream.
Maybe that's a good, maybe they're trying to get their clout back.
Maybe this is all the mainstream media trying to get their.
I wouldn't say anything like that. All nothing. But I do think that it's interesting that, in my opinion, I think there's times when the truth aligns with their interests. That doesn't mean that they care about the truth. And I think that it's about them losing, just like Biden's lost pretty much all of his political clout because of this narrative, and they've just maintained it. While literally I'll play this on the way out, every single group you can possibly look to that they've always told us to look to decide or to be able to discern whether things are war crimes. Every one of them are calling this genocide right now, which I think is an obvious reality. That's my opinion. But why then you would see only the government officials pushing back on that? And even then, my point is that's lost all of it. Even with the Democratic Party, he's lost all of his support because of this. So why would you keep doing it? Why is the media suddenly going the other direction? Like, it just seems super incongruent. And I just find that fascinating. I don't understand it, So anyway, I'm going to end with this clip. So give me your thoughts on this, guys. I think, look, I know we don't all agree exactly on what's going on, and that's okay. That's good. I appreciate that. But I think it's important that even when there's an emotional, like that topic, which just keeps me up at night, to be quite honest, I think it's super important that we care about the truth, even if it's something that is pushed back on as like you're being insensitive for even questioning it. I think it's important.
Yeah, no, I absolutely think we should definitely examine, and question all of it to seek the truth. I think we just need to be really careful about how you approach it, because even though, like you said, sometimes the truth aligns with their interests and their agenda. And I just very strongly feel like both sides are being played. And when you talk about like the government and, how they've all kind of aligned on this narrative and this mission, and the government doesn't care about the people. So, with they don't care about the Jews. They don't care about the Palestinians. That is not what they care about. They care about their power and their agenda. And oftentimes it's not even, this was the point that I was trying to make earlier. It's not necessarily just the interests of their power with their country. I think, unfortunately, right now, what we're really seeing is this supranational type of power structure that is pulling a lot of strings on these governing bodies. And so, therefore, they're working oftentimes very much against the interests of their own people. And what's really just very unfortunate about the situation in the Middle East is you have something that has been set up where you now have people in a region who, honestly, most people, now there are people who don't, there are extremists of all types, of all religions, of all walks of life, really. You're always going to find the radical extremists, the militant people, and you're always going to find just evil, hateful people. I mean, that just exists, unfortunately.
And you'll usually find a CIA agent too there.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally. And you can find a CIA agent trying to exploit that often,
somebody,
So I'm not denying any of that, but the reality is, you look at, just take Israel, for instance, you've got Christians there, you've got Muslims, you've got atheists, you've got pagans, you've got people of all different walks of life. And, there are interfaith marriages of, in that region where these people coexist and love each other. Unfortunately, they've been set up. They are victims because they have coexisted. And I brought up the example, last time of like, we did take land from the Native Americans. What are we supposed to do? That doesn't mean we don't have compassion for those people who have been displaced. But it's just a very unfortunate situation. But I just really, this is so long-winded. My main message is I really just want people to understand that, the interests of the government, the interests of the people who are in power making decisions are not necessarily aligned with the people. They're not necessarily even designed to protect those people. And oftentimes people's passions are being played and weaponized against them, and often to weaponize against each other.
Yeah,
exactly. Right. Equally on both sides too.
On both sides.
That's so crazy.
Well, the last thing I'll say too is I think that it's important to your point about the Native Americans aspect is I think one of the things that's tricking a lot of people in this is the same kind of binary thing we were discussing is that it's not as simple as saying Israel leaves or the Palestinians leave, right?
No.
Nobody honest in this conversation is saying that.
No.
The argument, like we talked about the other day, is, if we really want, like most Palestinian groups and resistance are really asking for the actual two-state solution at this point, where they are allowed to have some entity that they actually control, not some surreptitious Israel version of it that allows them to still have control over the area, which is what's ever been presented. And so that it ends up being, nobody's saying we should give all the land back to the Native Americans at this point. It's like the idea is that there has to be some equal application of international law. And exactly. How far back do you go? And, but you do have to engage with the reality, though. The idea being that I actually still think that Native Americans should be treated differently than how we have done that, even to this day, but not that you just go, everybody move back to Europe. Like, it doesn't make sense. Right. But when you frame it as that way, that's what you get the people online. They're like, anybody asking for a state for Palestine, therefore is calling for genocide. And it's gotten this extreme cartoonish debate going on. That's why I think what we're doing is important, to have these logical debates. I know he has to get going.
He has to go. Yeah. I will just have one thing really quickly. People do also need to understand the tenets of the extremists, because, I brought it up very in a glib reference, but Islam does mean to submit. And, one of their tenets is that everybody who is outside the faith needs to submit or be eradicated.
But does everybody believe that? Or do they all
I'm not saying that is the that is part of the belief system, and there are extremists who will very much align with it and stand for it.
Yeah,
and that
you can use Christianity the same way.
Exactly.
That's what Laura Loomer was saying the other day. It's like there's no such thing as radical Islam. It's just Islam.
I flat disagree with that.
I know.
It's just racist. The point is that there's clearly people, as Dave said in retort, that there's people, or any number of examples. I actually call back to, not that I necessarily agree with Ben Affleck, but that clip's been circulating with him and Ben, where he makes the point. He goes, most of them just want to live their lives and do their thing. And so we end up getting this extremist Loomer kind of analogy where all of them are bad and they don't even know it, and it's just like, that is bigotry, right? No matter how you spin it. And I think you're right, though. There is you can point out things that can lead to but I think it can.
I'm just saying this is where the complexity
absolutely
comes into play. And this is where it does get
we got to go.
Co-opted. Yeah. Okay.
But fair points. And I think that anything can be radicalized. And I think that's how we just have to embrace it like this and question whether or not it's honest or who's somebody driving it and so on. So any final thoughts, brother? I know you got to get going.
I was just going to say, I want to shout out to everybody in the chat that's watching along. Tony watches closely. He's been shouting out all our channels. So thank you for doing the admin work there, and everybody that's been hanging out with us. Like, you guys are awesome. I really appreciate. And there's some regulars in there. Yona, what's up, man? Biscotti, shout out to all you guys. But yeah, I mean, you can find my stuff at libertylinks.io/rebunked. I write articles. I run the TLAV Substack and all kinds of fun stuff. So
nice.
There you go.
Anything else? Shout before we go?
Yeah, I'm CourtenayTurner.com. So it's spelled like Courtenay, COURTENAY, TURNER.com. Find all of my stuff there.
Rock and roll. Well, thanks for tuning in, guys. As always, I think it's always very important and dialectical information, discussion. I just always say, this is so important, like that we actually have, especially when we have different opinions, that we have just an amicable discussion. Yeah. That doesn't mean, again, that you don't have to get, there's times to get angry about things, but there's when you're trying to discern the truth, it's important to, be amicable. And I think that's very important. So thank you both for being here. And as always, well, I was going to give my out for TLAV, but question everything, come to your own conclusions.
Question everything.
We'll see you next time.
Represent. Peace.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Given that a number of states have spoken about Palestine directly, we have prepared 3 replies, which we will read one after the other, and we kindly ask for your indulgence in that regard. We will first respond to Israel's statement. Mr. Chair, at the outset, let us remind Israel that our name is not the Palestinian Authority, but the State of Palestine. Sure, your finance minister said at an event in Paris earlier this year, there is no such thing as a Palestinian people. And your prime minister on the 24th of September held up a map at the General Assembly entitled The New Middle East, in which Palestine was deleted and replaced entirely with Israel. But if your government is annexationist and racist, this body is not, and we ask you to kindly adhere to UN protocol and nomenclature, and to show respect to all stakeholders in this room. Let us also remind the Israeli delegate that the lack of rules of procedure for this meeting does not give carte blanche to lose all sense of decorum when speaking to interlocutors in this room. To the other states and civil society in the room, let me simplify Israel's statement for you. Other than throwing insults around and making grave, baseless accusations, Israel said something that should make all of you shudder. It effectively said, I can kill any and every person in Gaza. The 2.3 million people in Gaza are either terrorists or terrorist sympathizers or human shields, and are therefore legitimate targets. Every person, according to Israel, falls into one of these three categories: a child, a journalist, a doctor, a UN staff, a newborn baby in an incubator. And so, according to Israel, it can kill them and then have the audacity to come to this room and tell the world with a straight face, we are acting in accordance with international law. The death of each of the over 11,350 people killed over the past month, be it children, journalists, UN staff, the sick, the elderly, according to Israel, was justified. Think about that for a moment and let it give you pause. Anyone espousing this warped logic has no shred of humanity, no sense of morality, and no knowledge of legality. But guess what? Your carpet explanation for carpet bombing will not fly. People are not fools. The people in this room are seasoned diplomats who are well-read, have a knowledge of history, and many of whom have seen your government make the same arguments during your 6 previous military aggressions on Gaza in the past 15 years. They have seen you resort to collective punishment, targeting of Palestinian children, journalists, medical staff, aid workers before. They have seen you forcibly transfer our communities, colonize our lands, demolish our homes, and evict families from their own properties since the 7th of October and for the 75 years that preceded it. They have seen your state-sponsored disinformation campaign before. Again, not fools, don't insult our intelligence. By saying that it is acting in accordance with international law, Israel is effectively saying the UN Secretary General, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the WHO, UNICEF, OCHA, UN Special Rapporteurs, the UN Independent Commission of Inquiry on the Situation, human rights organizations worldwide, disarmament NGOs worldwide, humanitarian NGOs worldwide, countless legal experts are all wrong. Everyone is lying about Israel violating international law, and we are asked instead to believe Israel, the state that is actually doing the indiscriminate killing. It is interesting that by saying even wars have rules, Israel quoted the very same UN Secretary General whose resignation it has called for because he dared to say that Israel has a history of occupying Palestinian land. The dissonance of hearing the Israeli representative talk about wars having rules as it commits genocide and breaches every rule in the book live on our TV screens is quite something. To Israel we say, we see through your PR and disinformation. The whole world sees through your PR and disinformation. The millions of people filling the streets in every major capital of the world, calling you out for genocide, sees through your PR and disinformation. Perhaps you think that with your incendiary rhetoric, we will all forget the incitement, the declarations and acts of Israeli officials, the people you represent, to wipe out Gaza, to drop a nuclear bomb on the Palestinian people, to destroy the human animals and children of darkness. Perhaps you think that your constant intimidation and threatening language will make everyone overlook the fact that Israel is, as we speak, killing babies, youth, women, men, elderly, no one too small or too old or too sick to be spared its wrath. Perhaps you think that by cutting off telecommunications and imposing yet another blackout on Gaza, you can continue to commit genocide while avoiding the annoyance of people being able to use their phones and computers to report on it. Perhaps you think that as your trigger-happy soldiers continue to kill journalists, 41 so far, the highest number of journalists killed over a 4-week period than in any conflict in the last 3 decades, you think that no one will be left to expose your crimes. Perhaps you think that by trying to silence anyone who tries to speak about your crimes, the international law violations of a state, by calling them either anti-Semites or terror supporters, people will be silent. And your intimidation campaign knows no bounds. They attack Palestinians, Jews, Israelis, UN officials, politicians, parliamentarians, university professors, and anyone worldwide who calls you out for your violations of international law. But guess what? Your intimidation and silencing will not work. We, along with all peace-loving nations and along with all people of conscience around the world, will not be silent. We will continue to call you out on your crimes, to call for accountability for your violations, for sanctions as your government continues to reject calls for a ceasefire, to massacre our people, and to entrench your colonial occupation and apartheid regime. Something your country should have learned over the past 75 years is that the Palestinian people are a people who refuse to disappear. And your nuclear threats and your bombs and your tanks and your bulldozers will never break the Palestinian people's will to be free and to live in the dignity and peace to which all people are entitled. Unlike you, we have consistently stood in this forum calling for respect for international law, for ethical principles to guide state behavior, for peace over war, for humanity over national interests, for disarmament over destruction. Once again, we stand in this forum to call on all states to respect and ensure respect for international law. Let the law be the measure by which all are judged, not propaganda and hateful, biased spin steeped in racism. And to Israel's absurd assertion that Palestinians have a problem with people of Jewish faith, and give the impression that this is a religious conflict, let us say loud and clear, this is not and has never been about religion. Had the occupiers of our land or the violators of our rights been Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, atheist, or of any other conviction, we would have called them out all the same. Palestine has always been multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious. People of Jewish faith have lived in historic Palestine as Palestinians for centuries. We consider them to be our brothers and sisters. And since the memory of the Holocaust has been invoked, let us also say loud and clear, we have the greatest of solidarity with both the victims and survivors of the Holocaust. It was not Palestinians that committed that horrific genocide, but the fascist forces that spawned from Europe. And it is unconscionable that a number of European leaders are again beating the drum as another genocide is now underway in Gaza. We are united with those hundreds of thousands of Jews around the world, including from organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace, If Not Now, Na'amod UK, who are calling out this genocide and chanting in the streets of New York, London, Paris, Berlin, Sydney, Toronto, and all major Western cities so that their governments can hear, not in our name, end the genocide in Gaza. With them, we stand together to end this pain and suffering. Together, we will not allow this to happen. Never again. is now.